Shalom. I hope that you are all well and that everything is going well in your life. I know these are difficult times, but as we look at the scriptures, God helps us to interpret the times that we're living in a different way and to understand them and to look forward to the coming of Mashiach Yeshua. As each day dawns, we know that that day when he will return is closer, and we look forward to that. Whatever difficulties you're enduring at the moment, I pray for you each day, and I know that Hashem is by your side. So today we're going to look at chapter 5 of Sefer Daniel. Chapter 5 describes the fall of Belshazzar. Nearly 70 years separate Daniel 1 from Daniel 5. Chronologically, chapter 5 should follow chapter 7 or chapter 8 by about 12 years. But this is not chronological. For whatever reason, this was written in this way, and so we study it in this way. So nearly 70 years have passed since we've seen Nebuchadnezzar's experience with insanity, if you like, until he came to the realization of who God was and proclaimed him not only supreme, but his God as well. And we know that he lived for one more year, so 69 years approximately have passed since his death, and he died in about 562 BCE. His death was followed by a confused chronology of insurrection, according to historians Berosus, who's recorded in the works of Josephus, who wrote in the first century. Berosus was still, his writings were still around at the time, but they are not today. And Abydos, a fragment of his history, was preserved by Eusebius, the biographer to Constantine, whose years are about 306 to 337 CE. So the extant histories of the time are preserved by later historians. Nebuchadnezzar was succeeded by his son Evil-Merodach, or Amiel Marduk, who ruled for 2 years and was assassinated in 560. Following that, Neriglissar, or Nerfarshar Usar, who was Evil-Merodach's brother-in-law and also his assassin, ruled for 4 years and was succeeded by his only son, Labaroso Arkod, or Labashi Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, who ruled for 9 months and was assassinated. So no continuity, no other long reign as with Nebuchadnezzar. Both Evil-Merodach and Neriglissar might have been rebel kings, or they might have only been viceroys. They were followed by Nabonidus, Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, who ruled for 17 years and was defeated by Cyrus and fled from Babylon. So a rather confused time for Babylon. Obviously, during such times, there's a loss of power of a nation when there's confused succession. According to Daniel, Evil-Merodach was followed by Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar is not even mentioned by the two historians that I described earlier, Berosus and Abydanus. He's not mentioned by them. Yirmiyahu refers to him in chapter 27, verse 7, as Nebuchadnezzar's son's son. Well, there's no term for son-in-law, so there's no way of actually specifically describing him as that. Yirmiyahu does not include either Evil-Merodach or Neriglissar in his chronology of Babylon's kings. He wasn't giving a history of Babylon. He was simply interpreting the scriptures and the signs for a particular period. So there was no particular reason why he should mention them. In 1854, Sir Henry Rawlinson, who died in March 5th, 1895 in London, he was a British Army officer and Orientalist. He deciphered the old Persian portion of the trilingual cuneiform inscription of Darius I the Great, providing the key to deciphering Mesopotamian cuneiform script. So for all time, up until that time, it was indecipherable. And he discovered and translated the Nabonidus cylinder. These memorials of Nabonid explain that Nabonidus' son, Belshazzar, was co-ruler with Nabonidus. He is described as the son of Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. It seems that Evil-Merodach was Belshazzar's father, and Nabonidus was Belshazzar's stepfather. Belshazzar became co-ruler about 553 BCE. Belshazzar's regency at the dating of the events of chapter 5 is confirmed by the prayer of Nabonidus, which indicated that he himself was absent from Babylon in Arabia at this time. So Belshazzar would have been the reigning personality in Babylon, while Nabonidus was in Arabia. The surrounding territory had already been conquered. Only the city was intact because of its fortified food supply. Now, when we come to chapter 5, that is background information. When we come to chapter 5, we see that Belshazzar is having a feast. He's having a feast similar to that which Xerxes had, which we read about in the book of Esther. These feasts were not at all unusual. They served to bolster Babylon and then Persia's support for its leader and to lift their spirits through wine. Any of you who've read Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death, which I think comes to mind at this moment, because basically in The Masque of the Red Death, the plague was outside and they had this great feast. They were enjoying themselves and pretending everything was fine. And I think to some degree, we see a similar kind of attitude here. They were pretending, supporting whatever their belief in the gods of Babylon. They were saying perhaps hopefully, that Babylon's gods were the greatest and that their rulers were the greatest. And in order to do this, Belshazzar brought out the golden temple vessels and displayed them. Belshazzar had had too much to drink, or he probably would not have committed this act of sacrilege against another nation's deity. Or unlike Nebuchadnezzar, who would never have used these vessels for any purpose, Belshazzar purposely brought out these vessels to demonstrate his lack of respect for the God of Israel and his superiority even to his grandfather. Because of his excessive drinking, he might have also felt that his gods would be honored by this act, a show of pride in his city and her creators, the gods. This was one way to remind his nobles of the past conquests and the glory of Babylon, the glory that belonged largely to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, but to encourage them to greater resistance to Persian attack. Now remember, the surrounding territory has been conquered, and only the city is fortified and still unconquered. And in the midst of this siege, Belshazzar has a festival, has a feast, celebrates. What is he celebrating? Here's a description of the city of Babylon. The great Euphrates River flowed through the middle of the city in a general north-south direction and was bordered by walls on each side to protect the city from attack from the river. Within these walls were beautiful avenues, parks, and palaces. Many of the streets were lined with buildings 3 and 4 stories high. Among these buildings were the Temple of Bel, an 8-story structure, and the magnificent Palace of the King, actually a complex of buildings which have now been excavated. A great bridge spanned the Euphrates River, connecting the eastern section and the western or new section of the city. The bridge was later supplemented by a tunnel mentioned by Diodorus, another historian. The famed Hanging Gardens of Babylon were large enough to support trees. In many respects, Babylon was the most fabulous city of the ancient world, both for the beauty of its architecture and for the safety of its huge walls and fortifications. It was hard for the Babylonians to believe that even the Medes and the Persians, who had surrounded their beloved city, could possibly breach the fortifications or exhaust their supplies, which were intended to be ample for a siege of many years. Their confidence in their gods was bolstered by their confidence in their city. While Belshazzar was drinking toast to his gods from the temple vessels, God intervened once more in Babylon's history. The cup of Babylonian iniquity was full. God had given Babylon many opportunities to understand that he was the king of the universe, that he was sovereign, that he was the only God. They had not accepted any of this, but went on their own way, despite Nebuchadnezzar's statement and profession towards the end of his life. God's prophecy about Babylon was about to be fulfilled. If you look at chapter 2 of this book, and also Yeshayahu 13 and 14, Yirmiyahu 50, 51, and Ivratim 10, 31, where we read, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." When the writing appeared on the wall, Belshazzar's response was fear. In the midst of this great banquet and feast, with Belshazzar drinking toasts to his gods, suddenly writing appears on the wall before them. Belshazzar's face became pale and his mind agitated. We're told that he had inner pains, such as lower back, kidney, abdomen, etc. His knees trembled and knocked together, and he uttered a cry of distress as one seeking a remedy. Once again, as in the days before, the wise men were called to read the writing, which may have been in a Samaritan form of Hebrew. And they were offered great honors and material possessions if they could only read the writing. Belshazzar was desperate, and in his desperation, he even offered the position as the third ruler after Nabonidus and himself. But once again, these wise men failed to be of any assistance. At this moment, Daniel was remembered. The queen recalled Daniel's service to Belshazzar's father. Of course, she's referring to Nebuchadnezzar. There's no word for grandfather in Semitic languages, and so the usages of a father's father is reserved for great-great-grandfather. So father is the only thing they really have. This is most likely Nebuchadnezzar's widow, according to Polyhistora, as cited by Cedrenus. Amit. Interestingly, she is also, this is Nebuchadnezzar's widow, is also the sister of Darius the Mede and the aunt of Cyrus. Very well-connected lady. Or it could have also been Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Belshazzar's mother, Nitocris, an eminent and wise lady of public affairs. Both of these women are known. Daniel is described as a wise man and as one who unbinds what is bound, a judge of wisdom and skill. This is a sort of language that is typically used to describe a major and important judge of the East. It is also said that the gods aided Daniel. And so Daniel was called to the king. Belshazzar ascertained that this is the same Daniel of whom the queen has spoken. He describes to Daniel everything that he's heard about him and the failure of his own wise men. And he now offers Daniel the same things that he offered them. You too can be third in my kingdom, and I'll give you all of this. Well, when Daniel spoke, it was in a very different way from the way he spoke to Nebuchadnezzar. First of all, he rejected the gifts and the honors, noting that they will be of little use to one who knows that the city will shortly be destroyed, indicating that he is able to supply the interpretation of this writing. There's no formal salutation, and this indicated Daniel's utter contempt for Belshazzar. No doubt in comparison with the other rulers, that he has served through the years, Belshazzar comes at the bottom of the list. Daniel says to him, basically, keep your gifts, but I will tell you nonetheless. What follows is the sermon of an aged prophet to a young and presumptuous ruler. Nebuchadnezzar's greatness and kingdom, he says, came from the Most High God, that is, the God of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar ruled because of the God of Israel. But Nebuchadnezzar was a despot and was overtaken with arrogance and pride. So God removed him for a time, and he became an animal until he acknowledged God's omnipotence, the God of Israel's omnipotence, not Bel's. Daniel compares Belshazzar with Nebuchadnezzar in arrogance. Belshazzar has committed an even greater act of blasphemy than Nebuchadnezzar. He has glorified gods who cannot see, hear, or know anything. He has abased the one true God who controls his destiny. He's done all these things with the full knowledge of Nebuchadnezzar and all that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And now Daniel looks at the writing. He explains that this later act of blasphemy, this final act of blasphemy, made Belshazzar and Babylon ripe for judgment, and thus God's condemning words were presented. Here is an explanation of the writing. It was probably not written in either cuneiform or Aramaic because both could have been read by the wise men. Most likely, as I said previously, it was written in the form of Hebrew that was common when Daniel went into captivity. This was later called Samaritan Hebrew, but similar to Arabic and Syriac in meaning, also without vowel points, of course. Here is the translation of the writing. Each word stands for a short sentence. Mene, which is doubled for emphasis, means numeration. God has numbered, he has summed up your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, weighing, you are weighed in the balance and found lacking. Perez, division, also a play on the word for Persian. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Belshazzar kept his promise to Daniel, although Daniel knew that the honors bestowed by him were short-lived and purposeless. And so the last official act of Babylon, of a king of Babylon, of a ruler of Babylon, was to honor a Jew who had predicted its fall. God is a God of irony. Belshazzar was killed that night, and Babylon was conquered by Darius the Mede. Here is Greek historian Herodotus, who lived 484 to 425 BCE. Here is his account of the fall of Babylon. Cyrus resumed his march on Babylon. As soon as he was in striking distance, they attacked him, but were defeated and forced to retire inside their defenses. As they had taken the precaution of accumulating in Babylon a stock of provisions sufficient to last many years, they were able to regard the prospect of a siege with indifference. Cyrus was beginning to despair of success when somebody suggested to him a way out of the deadlock. The plan was as follows. He stationed part of his force at the point where the Euphrates flows into the city, and another contingent at the opposite end where it flows out, with orders to both to force an entrance along the riverbed as soon as they saw the water was shallow enough. By means of a cutting, he diverted the river into the lake, which was then a marsh, and in this way so greatly reduced the depth of the water in the actual bed of the river that it became fordable, and the Persian army entered the river, now only deep enough to reach about the middle of a man's thigh, and making their way along it, got into the town. If the Babylonians had learned what Cyrus was doing, or had even seen it for themselves, in other words, if Belshazzar hadn't been busy eating and drinking, getting drunk, they could have let the Persians enter, and then, by shutting all the gates which led to the water side and manning the walls on either side of the river, they could have kept them in a trap and wiped them out. But as it was, they were taken by surprise. The Babylonians themselves say that owing to the great size of the city, the outskirts were captured without the people in the center knowing anything about it. Where were their guards? There was a festival going on, and even while the city was falling, they continued to dance and enjoy themselves until hard facts brought them to their senses. The fabled city of Babylon presents another accurate and remarkable picture of fulfilled prophecy evidenced by archaeological discovery. Prophets Yeshayahu, who lived 783 to 704, and Yirmiyahu, who lived from 626 to 586, declared Babylon's destiny as one of divine judgment. Yeshayahu, Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherd will rest his flocks there. But desert creatures will lie there. Jackals will fill her houses. There the owls will dwell, and there the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will howl in her luxurious palaces. Again from Yeshayahu, I will turn her into swampland. I will sweep her with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord Almighty. And from Yirmiyahu, before your eyes I will repay Babylon and all who live in Babylonia for all the wrong they have done in Zion, declares the Lord. No rock will be taken from you for a cornerstone, nor any stone for a foundation. Again from Yirmiyahu. Babylon will be a heap of ruins, a haunt of jackals, an object of horror and scorn. The sea will rise over Babylon, her towns will be desolate, a dry and desert land, a land where no one lives, through which no one travels. This occurred to such a degree that for centuries, those who were supposed to be educated and intelligent believed that Babylon was simply a myth, one of the myths of the ancient world, until it was discovered. Babylon was indeed a wonder of the ancient world. According to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, this great commercial center encompassed 196 square miles with a 56-mile circumference. It was surrounded by a moat 30 feet wide and double walls. The outer wall of the city was 311 feet high. That's approximately 3 stories, and 87 feet wide. That means that 11 cars could sit side by side on top of the wall. 100 gates into the city were constructed of solid brass. Babylon's 250 watchtowers were over 400 feet high. Incredible. And yet, where were the watchers on the day that Babylon was taken by the Persians? The chances that this magnificent city would suffer the specific fate outlined by Yeshayahu and Yirmiyahu, writing before the Babylonian captivity of Yehuda, which began in 586, have been calculated as 1 in 5 billion. And yet today, Babylon is completely uninhabited. Even the Bedouins refuse to pitch their tents on this site or to keep their sheep here because of deep-rooted superstitions. Wild animals, owls, jackals, etc., skulk through and around the desolate, naked waste, while bricks and building supplies of many kinds have been salvaged from the ruins of other cities. The great rocks that were imported at huge cost to Babylon have never been moved. The Babylon of Hammurabi and most of ancient Babylon lies under a bed of silt below the water table because the river has spread over the land. Babylon is not even on the popular tourist routes and therefore has few human visitors. God has kept his promise. Babylon was overthrown as surely and as totally as Sodom and Gomorrah. And even Saddam Hussein, who made the attempt, was unable to rebuild it. Consider this. Just as Babylon was overtaken, while its inhabitants were partying, drinking, and blaspheming God, sure of their complete security, at the same moment the destroyers awaited so it will be at the end of days when Mashiach Yeshua will return. We're told he will return suddenly. Suddenly, judgment will come on those who have rejected God's continual warnings in exactly the way that Babylon was taken unawares while its leaders were having a party. The disasters of this world, whatever they might be, in whatever form, will never overtake God's children. Even as Daniel emerged from Babylon's destruction to triumph as a leader in the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, so in Mashiach's kingdom, by the power of the atoning sacrifice of Mashiach Yeshua, we conquer and overcome Hasatan to rule with Mashiach eternally. This is a chapter of encouragement, and we should be encouraged when we see the power of our God to accomplish that which he says he will do. As he has done in the past, so he will do in the future. Trust in him. Believe that what he promises is true and will come to pass. We look forward to that day. I wish you a good rest of the week, and I look forward to seeing you on Shabbat. God bless you.